We're still in the module on principles and frameworks, and this is a 3-part lecture on key concepts. So we'll cover epistemology, methodology, and reflexivity. The learning outcome here is to understand the principles shaping qualitative research practices and to justify research practice decisions in relation to those principles. So in this lecture, I'm going to talk about the foundations that underpin the way that we do research. So we're going to talk about different philosophies or frameworks or positions. We can use different language to describe what it is that we're talking about. But essentially, it's about the theoretical perspectives that shape the way that we do research. So this is really important to note a distinction here. I'm not talking about the theories that help us understand the topic of our research. I'm talking about the theories that shape the way we do our research and the way that we think about our research. I'm not trying to convince you that any one of these perspectives or theories is better than another, although I do have an opinion. And I'm not even going to teach you about any of those individual frameworks. So, for example, you're not going to come out of this lecture understanding the difference between different methodologies, and you're not going to come out of this lecture understanding the difference between different theoretical perspectives. The aim of this lecture is for you to understand that there are different philosophies or frameworks or positions underpinning all research. So this is not just about qualitative, this is about all research. And to understand that these frameworks fundamentally shape the decisions we make about how to collect data, how we interact with participants, how we do analysis and who does analysis, how we see our relationships as researchers to participants, how we describe the products of our analysis, and the very language that we use to describe what we've gotten from participants. It doesn't matter to me which of the frameworks you adopt in your future research. The important thing is to be coherent and consistent in the way that you apply those frameworks, and to remember that you are always adopting a position among many optional positions. So the way that I've structured these the first two parts of the lecture is to draw on a framework from Crotty. So I've set this as an optional read. Some of you will find this really useful. I don't think that it's essential reading, but I think it's for those of you who find this interesting, I think it's a really great read. And in fact, his book is a really useful book. So the framework he has is to think about the different theoretical positions or frameworks that shape our research. So methods at the very bottom of this structure are the most practical and the concrete parts of our research, moving to methodology and then theoretical perspective and then epistemology at the most abstract and most explicitly theoretical, I guess. So in the doing of our research, we're often thinking more at that bottom level at the methods and less directly thinking about that kind of top abstract level. But all of those different levels have an impact on the way that we do our research. So let's start at the bottom because that's a familiar place for all of us to think about. So we'll start with methods. So methods are the practical activities or tools or techniques of research that we use to gather and analyze our data. They are specific and defined. So when we talk about them, we often talk very specifically, not just about doing interviews, but about doing semi-structured interviews. And be clear about who is doing the interview and the kinds of questions that we'll ask, and even the kinds of ways that we'll interact with a participant. We don't just talk about doing an analysis of our data. We will talk about doing a thematic analysis of our data and bring in particular ideas about what are the way we code and the way we develop themes and even what a theme means. So they're specific and defined. Here are some examples of different kinds of methods that you will be familiar with. So anything that's about sampling, practical, concrete things, the activities that we do in deciding who is going to engage with our research, the ways that we go about collecting data, the ways that we go about doing our analysis. So that's methods. Let's move up our schema and talk about methodology. Methodology is not about the concrete things that we do, but it's about the theories and practices guiding our research. So if we look at this definition from Kaplan, methodology is the study, so the description, the explanation, and the justification of the methods, and not the methods themselves. So their methodology helps us to understand not the products of our inquiry, but the process of our inquiry. So you can see how we've shifted from the concrete to the more abstract. So we're thinking now about the process that we do. So when someone says to you in a project that you're doing, what's your methodology? They're asking you about a framework that you're using that contains a whole load of assumptions about what counts as research and how it's conducted. And we're going to talk a bit more specifically about those things in a minute. So particularly about epistemology and theoretical perspectives. But they're also asking you about a theory or a framework for how research should proceed. So a methodology is a strategy for your inquiry. Methodologies are really crucial for us in the practice of research, and we are using them all the time. It's much more explicit in qualitative research, but it's true for all types of research. And methodologies work at different points in our research process. So a methodology will reflect the methods that we use. So think about when you write up a report about a project that you did, or your dissertation, or a journal article, you are describing the methods that you used. Now, often that's slightly more idealized than the practical reality of what we did, but it reflects the methods that we used. We also draw on recognized methodologies to guide our methods, to help us make decisions about what things to do, what practical steps to take. We also use existing methodologies to justify our methods, to give an explanation of why we made the decisions that we did. A methodology will interact with your objectives and your research questions. So some methodologies are suited to particular kinds of ways of thinking about a problem, and some problems suggest particular kinds of ways of thinking about methodology. And this will become apparent in the next set of lectures about methodologies and in our learning activity. Methodologies also connect us back or up to theories and disciplines which they come from, so particular assumptions about the world are built into methodologies. And that means that the methodology helps us make decisions about how participants are selected, the methods of data collection and analysis, who can or should conduct the research, and the role of the researcher. And some methodologies have very particular and strong rules about lots of these different things, and some methodologies have much vaguer or more general kinds of ideas about these things. And again, this is something that will come out a bit more when we look at specific methodologies. But for now, here's a reminder of some of the things we're talking about when we talk about methodologies, the types of methodologies that we are familiar with: experimental survey research. In qualitative, people talk about methodology, they mean an ethnography, a grounded theory project, a discourse analysis, participatory action research, narrative inquiry, and we're going to talk about a lot of these in more detail. You can also create your own methodology for your project. So it might be that these existing methodologies don't quite suit you. And so you can create your own coherent argument to justify your methods rather than relying on one of these existing methodologies. And there's obviously some pluses and minuses to this. So drawing on a recognized methodology, like you're doing a grounded theory project or you're doing an ethnography, gives you a strong tradition to draw on, and that can be work very well for you rhetorically. So in terms of seeking grant funding or publishing, that you say, I'm doing a grounded theory project, people understand what it is that you're doing on, they have certain expectations about the kinds of ways you're going about doing it. It gives you a direct line back to those theories and disciplines that you can use to justify the decisions that you're making. And most useful of all, it means you get lots of structured guidance about what to do and how to do it. The downside of that can be that structured guidance can feel like rules that might constrain you in terms of the work that you're doing, which may not necessarily best suit your research question or your research problem. and it can mean you become very compliance focused. So we really need to be thinking about methodologies as resources for us to use rather than labels to slap on the work that we've done to reassure everybody that we were doing it in a sensible way. But some projects, a particular methodology doesn't quite fit, and so customizing a methodology, whether you're putting two together, so you might do a grounded theory ethnography or creating something for yourself, provides lots of flexibility and hopefully means that you're really thinking through your research problem and the different levels of the theoretical perspectives that shape the work that you're doing. Of course, we need to guard against just making things up without thinking it through. So we need to understand the assumptions that are guiding the work that we do. And of course, if you don't have an existing methodology to draw on, it can, for some audiences, be a problem. So people are reassured if you say that you're using grounded theory or ethnography, and if you say, oh, I'm not using one of those methodologies, I've developed it myself, you do have to work harder to reassure people that you're doing good work. So let's move up again through our framework. So we've done methods and methodology. We're now moving into theoretical perspective. So becoming more abstract, moving away from the concrete. So a theoretical perspective is the philosophical stance or paradigm or model, which is usually built into our methodology. There's lots of assumptions about the world and the social world that sit in the particular methodologies that we're working with. And those different ways of viewing the world shape different ways of researching the world. And this should become more obvious as we go through. Let's look at some examples. So you should all be very familiar with positivism or post-positivism because it really is the default theoretical perspective in science and in a lot of the kinds of work that we do in health and medicine. Positivism and post-positivism really is the natural science approach to research. So the idea that research is value-free and detached, that we're looking to identify universal features or laws that offer us an explanation for something. And an explanation offers us the possibility of prediction and, of course, control. Positivism endorses the idea of an objective existence of a meaningful reality. And we're going to talk about this in relation to epistemology in the next lecture. So that reality is value neutral, ahistorical, cross-cultural, i.e. it's universal. So what that means is positivism starts from the position that if you go about your research in the right way, you will discover this underlying reality. In opposition to this really is interpretivism. And interpretivism really is the default position in qualitative research. So it's what most qualitative research is drawing on. And once I talk a little bit about it, it should be familiar in terms of the kinds of ideas that we've talked about for the first few weeks of this unit. So the starting point from interpretivism is that the social and the human world cannot be studied using the scientific method that we use in natural sciences. There are no universal laws underlying and controlling behavior. To understand and explain human and social reality, we need to look for meaning in the subjective experiences of individuals engaging in the world. We need to understand the world through the eyes of our participants. This should be ringing bells in terms of the kinds of ways we've been talking about collecting data, for example, or in the kinds of ways that we've been talking about sampling. Interpretivism also draws on the idea that what we know is bound up with how we know. So we cannot separate knowledge from the context of its production. So knowledge is always historical, contextual, political, and social. So you can see just in the kind of brief overview that I've given you of positivism and interpretivism, they're coming from really, really different perspectives. Now, one of the things to notice about Crotty's framework, so moving from the very concrete methods through methodology to theoretical perspectives and beyond, the more we move up that structure, the less we can move across the different types of things within that structure. So we can easily put together and mix different methods. We can even to some extent mix different kinds of methodologies. It is impossible to mix positivism and interpretivism. They're coming from really different positions. They have really different ideas about what counts as research and what good research looks like. And that's because they're built on different groundings in terms of the very sense of reality that might exist. And we're going to come to that in the next part of the lecture.